Good afternoon. I have the tremendous honor of introducing our keynote speaker, Cyntoia Brown Long. Cyntoia Brown Long is an author, speaker, and advocate for criminal justice reform and victims of trafficking. Cyntoia had a difficult start in life. She was born to an alcoholic teenage mother who was also a victim of sex trafficking. Cyntoia experienced a sense of isolation, low self-esteem, and alienation that drove her straight into the hands of a predator. This is similar to the stories that we heard from the girls earlier today. Cyntoia was trafficked during her early teenage years and at the age of 16 was arrested for killing a man who solicited her for sex. She was tried as an adult and was sentenced to life in prison without a chance of parole for 51 years. Her trafficker was never arrested. In prison, Cyntoia's life took a dramatic turn when the prison education principal took her under her wing and introduced her to a spiritual path. She encouraged Cyntoia to build a positive life in prison and to resist the negative influences that lead to despair. Her memoir, Free Cyntoia, My Life Search for Redemption in the American Prison System, written while in prison, documents her early years and the 15 years she was incarcerated, and it takes readers on a coming-of-age spiritual journey. Set against the shocking backdrop of a life behind bars and the injustice of sentencing sex-trafficked juveniles as an adult, Cyntoia struggled to overcome a legacy of birth family addiction and a lifetime of being ostracized and abandoned by society. Cyntoia hopes her story will not only inspire others, but also shine a light on the injustice that people still face on a daily basis, especially the injustice to women and children in American prisons. Please join me in welcoming Cyntoia Brown Long.
So I'm sure most of us here today can spout off random facts to identify ourselves when asked the question, who are you? We can easily pull out adjectives and descriptors detailing our likes, dislikes, talents, accomplishments, titles, and various other attributes to identify who we are as a person. But if you're anything like me, then there'll be a point in your lives when the earthly titles that we give ourselves will fall short of helping you to understand who you truly are. There will come a time when you realize that all of the effort and the energy that you put into your career, your talents, your social relationships can't satisfy the basic longing for every human being to just feel wanted, accepted, and loved. Each of us will have at least one moment in our lives when we look around and find ourselves alone, vulnerable, and dissatisfied. I had my first encounter with this struggle when I was just 5 years old. It all began the day that I started elementary school. Since it was the first day, everyone's parents had got to bring them into the classroom. And while my parents spoke with my teacher, I started to get to know my classmates. I hadn't been sitting there for 10 minutes before one of them had asked me why I didn't look like my parents. It's not something that I had ever given much thought to. My family had never made me feel any different from them, so I had never really entertained the possibility that somehow we didn't match. But sitting there in the classroom and looking up at my two dark-skinned parents and then back down at my own light skin, confusion started to set in. When my mother came back to the school later that day to pick me up, I wasted no time asking her the same question that had been posed to me. She ended up telling me that I was mixed, both black and white, and that her and my father had adopted me from a white woman who couldn't take care of me. She tried to reassure me that I was beautiful and that I was loved just the way that I was, but a seed of doubt had taken root in my spirit, and I couldn't help but see life through a different lens after that moment. Now, I just saw how different I was from everyone. My family, my church members, my friends. Everywhere I looked, I felt like I stuck out like a sore thumb. In every situation, my mind automatically found all the things that distinguished me from the people around me. By the time that I was in the 5th grade, I was walking around with the chip on my shoulder the size of Texas. I didn't want to make friends at school, and I had no interest in being the teacher's pet either. I visited the principal's office on a fairly regular basis and quickly became known as the bad kid. The smallest eye roll or smart remark was all the excuse that the teacher needed to get me sent to the principal's office. It was clear to me that the school looked for any excuse to just push me to the outskirts whenever they felt that I was posing a problem. Thanks to a zero tolerance policy at my middle school, bringing a bottle of caffeine pills for show and tell landed me in alternative school when I was just 12 years old. Things for me had begun to spiral out of control pretty quickly after that. I remember my mother's constant refrain being, "What are you thinking? And why can't you just go to school and learn like everyone else?" But I wasn't like everyone else. As a matter of fact, I didn't even know who I was, and that had always been at the heart of my problem. It took less than 6 months from the time that I entered alternative school for me to end up in juvenile court. My charge partners were 3 of the older kids there at the school. Whenever I went before the judge for the hearing on the charges, it seemed like just a formality. The attorney that my father had hired pulled us off to a corner of the courtroom before the hearing was set to start and informed us that I was going to be sent away to a facility for 30 days to be evaluated. And I remember just feeling so confused by the fact that I had never had the opportunity to explain myself or defend myself before they decided to just ship me off. And I was never really the same after experiencing life inside the system at that young age. When I was sent back home and returned to public school, I was more of an outcast than ever before. They placed me in a special ed class to keep me away from the other students. The classroom wasn't even off of the main hallway of the school. It was tucked away in back of another classroom. And if you didn't know where you were going, you would have never found it. Once you were in this class, you weren't even permitted to leave the classroom throughout the day unless you were going to lunch. And if that weren't hidden enough, they had brought in a partition from the ISS room specifically for me and installed it in the back of the classroom behind the teacher's desk so that I could be kept away from the other students. It was glaringly obvious to me that I was not welcome nor wanted in school. And naturally, it wasn't long after that before they got rid of me again. This time bypassing alternative school altogether and going through the court to have my probation violated. Oddly enough, I felt a sense of relief whenever I was sent back to the facility. I didn't feel out of place there. I felt that I was in the company of my peers and not the bad egg that was constantly being singled out. But life inside the facility, constantly having to fight and never really feeling like I had a voice, took a toll on me. So it wasn't long before I ran away from that facility and started living on the streets of Nashville as a runaway. Every day that I was on the run, there was another high drama event that played out, and I slowly started becoming desensitized to a world where everything my mother had ever taught me was turned on its head. As hard as it was living on the streets, I didn't feel like an outcast. So even as things were just spiraling out of control, I couldn't bring myself to just go back home. Even though I was just 13, all of the people that I was around while I was on the run were adults. And they had no problem allowing me to do and learn things that no 13-year-old girl ever should. These women taught me how to use my conversation and companionship to get money out of men. They taught me that my body was a commodity. There was always a direct correlation between sex and finances. Living in the house, if we were having sex, we had to pay a bill. Having sex was nothing more than a means to make sure I had food in my mouth, clothes on my back, and a roof over my head. The time that I spent around them, I was learning that my identity was tied up with how people valued me. The way that I walked, dressed, talked, and even the things that I found interest in all revolved around what would please a man. All the men that I met through them were much older than me. Most in their mid to late 20s, and some in their 30s and even 40s. Each of them conveniently ignored the fact that I was just 13 and 14 years old, often telling me that I was mature for my age, and they liked that about me. At times, being with these men also met my need to feel wanted. There was something empowering about the effect that I had on them. I found a sense of pride in the fact that I was being pursued and sought after because of what I could do for them. At that time, I wasn't walking any dark street corners. There were never any overt propositions. None of them ever openly offered me goods or money in exchange for being with them. But from the moment that we met, there was an unspoken understanding that when we saw each other, anything I asked for would be given to me in exchange for our time together. All of these lessons completely altered my worldview when it came to relationships. And all the feelings of me wanting to be wanted, to belong, to just be accepted would culminate into me meeting the man that I would later come to know as my trafficker. At the time, I called him my older boyfriend. He was 24 and I was just 16. His name was Cut, which was short for cutthroat. And if anyone would have ever told me that he was my pimp, I would have told them they were crazy. The time that I spent with him was just this whirlwind of fear, but also this intense longing. One minute he would make me feel like I was the only girl in the world. And the next, without any provocation whatsoever, he seemed to despise me. I wanted so bad for him to love me that there was nothing he could have asked me to do that I would have told him no. He had quickly picked up on the fact that my identity revolved around the need to be wanted and accepted. I believe that if I could just do all of the things to make him smile, to make him want me, to make myself valuable to him, that we could live happily ever after. So even when it felt like the life was just being sucked out of me, I stayed loyal to him. And whenever he said it was time, I went out, I did what I had to do, and I came back to him. Each time thinking, this is going to be the time that he's going to receive me with open arms. I'd come back to the room so excited with that money crumpled up in my pocket, thinking, Cut's going to be so happy when he sees what I'm bringing to the table. Surely this time will prove what a good girl I am. But there was simply no dollar amount that made Cut love me. Each time that I realized that although I thought I had done good, my best was never good enough, a small part of me died. The self-esteem that I had built based on how beautiful and how attractive, how valuable I was, slowly withered away into me feeling worthless and desperate. On August 7th, 2004, Cut would send me from our hotel room for the very last time. After once again walking into a situation where I was in way over my head, I shot and killed the 43-year-old man who picked me up for sex that night. Within 24 hours, Metro Police were standing in my hotel room cocking a shotgun at my back. I raised my hands and yelled the first thing that came to my mind. Cut had nothing to do with it. I'll tell y'all everything. I never gave any thought to protecting my own interests or to how protecting Cut could negatively impact me. The only thought in my mind was to make sure he was okay. Because at that time, my entire existence revolved around making sure Cut was taken care of. After I confessed, I was taken to juvenile detention. Even though I had told the officers that I shot the man out of fear, I was charged with murder and especially aggravated robbery. The public defender who was assigned to my case came to visit me almost every day. She seemed fascinated with all the stories that I had about life on the run. To her, my life seemed like something out of a movie. She would sit at the table with me with this quizzical expression on her face as I explained everything about how to navigate life on the streets. I figured it was because she was a privileged upper middle class white woman who never had any real life experience. But she was determined to get me to understand that the way of life that I had come to know was not normal for any 16-year-old. She was especially determined to get me to understand that Cut was not my older boyfriend, as I continued to proclaim. She kept telling me that the only hope I had of not being tried as an adult was to open up to the judge and tell her everything that had happened leading up to the night of my arrest. But Cut still had a hold on me. And I was determined that no consequence could convince me to be disloyal to him. It wasn't until she came and sat with me one day, bringing a notepad with her, and she took out a pen and separated this page into 4 sections. She labeled them good things about Cut, bad things about Cut, things Cut does that makes me feel good, things Cut does that makes me feel bad. And while I struggled to fill in the list of things that Cut did to make me feel good, there wasn't enough room on the page for me to write all of the things he did to make me feel bad. It forced me to realize that I had come to a place where how other people felt was more important to me than my own feelings. I had neglected myself for so long that I couldn't even tell you who I was. As I sat there at that table, I couldn't come up with a single adjective to describe my personality, my talents, goals, even my preferences. I had become so consumed with living for other people that I had completely lost myself. When my transfer hearing came around, the prosecutor in my case fought to convince the court that there was nothing left to salvage of my 16-year-old life, and that all that was left was to simply throw me away. And 2 weeks later, my public defender brought me the news that he was successful. The judge ruled to try me as an adult. I remember seeing the DA on the news later that evening. I was sitting there in my cell just feeling doomed and defeated, trying to scrape up an understanding of what had just happened and how I even got in this situation in the first place. And there he was on the TV screen with this look of joy, feeling proud of himself. He told the reporters, "She's dangerous, and the public needs to be protected a whole lot more than anything that can be done for her." I have never forgotten those words. Since I was only 16, when I was arrested for murder. Once I was transferred to the adult jail, I had to spend the 2 years leading up to my 18th birthday in solitary confinement. I was kept to myself for 23 hours a day. And for 1 hour a day, I was handcuffed and shackled and allowed to come out and use the phone, use the microwave, sit at a table, take a shower. But many days, the only sunlight I saw came from a 12-inch window in the concrete wall, and the only human interaction from the guard bringing me my food tray. When I finally went to trial, I was convicted on all counts. The jury never got to hear my side of what happened because my attorney had advised me against testifying. I had to sit there with a blank look on my face while a bunch of strangers argued about whether or not I was a monster. At one point, the DA showed the jury a naked picture that Cut had taken of me that was recovered in the hotel room the night of my arrest. To him, it was proof of what an unsavory person I was. As a matter of fact, the whole prosecution stance was that I needed to be put away because I was a murderous prostitute. At that time, the term sex trafficking didn't apply to girls like me. In the end, the DA was successful. And once the jury read their verdict, the judge sentenced me to life in prison. I would be 67 years old before I would ever be considered for release from prison. It was hard to fathom losing the rest of my life as I knew it when I had never really even begun living. I had never got a driver's license, not even a learner's permit. Never been to prom, never went to homecoming. I wasn't even old enough to vote. Once I got back, I lay on my bunk in the dark and just wept. I remember begging God to free me. I cried out to him, confused and unsure of what to do at that point, and I just told him, if you let me out of here, I will tell the world about you. That was back in August of 2006. And as the years went on with me still sitting in a Tennessee prison, serving a life sentence, my faith began to die. At one point, I told anyone who would listen that I didn't believe in God. 4 years into my sentence, I found myself once again alone, vulnerable, and dissatisfied with my life. Determined not to make the same mistakes that I did as a teenager, I chose to sign up for a college program offered at the prison run by Lipscomb University. And once I got in, I quickly realized that it was so much more than just a college course. I was taken aback with how these strangers believed in me and were willing to invest in my potential. They saw something in me worth salvaging. And beyond that, they provided a community where I belonged. And not because of anything that I could do for them or how I looked or my abilities. I was accepted simply because I was me. And their Christian faith told them that was enough. I began to grow in ways that I had never imagined possible. If you had asked me to tell you about myself, I could go on and on about my talents in problem solving and research, my tenacity and boldness. I could tell you all about the dreams I had and the determination to push past any kind of obstacles that try to stand between me and them. I had come to a place where I was secure in who I was. I finished my associate's degree. I got my bachelor's degree, earning a 4.0 GPA for both. And I became a mentor to the other women in the prison. I had gone from wandering the streets of Nashville aimlessly to having opportunities to sit with elected officials and advise them on how to improve the system for other girls like me. I was thriving in a situation that was supposed to break me. And as great as all that was, what I really wanted was my freedom. I was convinced that after spending all the years that I had studying the law, developing relationships with powerful people, and maintaining a good record at the institution, that freedom was just a matter of a well-crafted appeal delivered by a seasoned attorney. But even with 7 of the best attorneys that money could buy, including a former Tennessee Supreme Court justice, a former Court of Criminal Appeals judge, every single court that I went before to ask for my conviction to be overturned told me no. On November 2016, my very last appeal was denied, and the federal court refused to grant me permission to appeal. There was no other court that I could go to. Any hope that I had had of overturning my conviction was dead. But just when I was starting to think that I may never get out of prison, God sent me a message. It was January 2017 when I received a letter in the mail from a young man named Jamie in Texas. He told me that the Lord was saying to prepare myself because I was about to get out of prison. When I told Jamie that I didn't believe in God, he said, it's because you haven't met his son, Jesus. I told him, I grew up with religion. I grew up in the church. But Jamie let me know that what the Lord desires is relationship. And let me just say, healthy relationships were not exactly my strong point. Everything that I had ever been taught about relationship was transactional. And it always involved me giving way more of myself than the other person was willing to give in return. But having a relationship with Jesus wasn't about what I could give him in exchange for what he was offering. And Jamie assured me that if I gave a relationship with him a try, that I would experience fulfillment unlike anything that I had ever experienced in this life. And he was right. Before I knew it, I was learning to love myself in a completely different way. I was coming to view myself independent of what I was able to accomplish in the classroom or all the talents and attributes that I could so comfortably spout off whenever someone asked me to tell them about myself. I had rejected all the lies that I had ever been told, that I was unworthy, that I was shameful, and that I would forever be defined by the worst things that I had ever done. I embraced the fact that I was freed, forgiven, chosen, and set apart by one who no one on this earth could override. Jamie and I continued to grow closer as we sat on the phone and prayed for God's will to be done in my case. We prayed for God to touch the heart and minds of every single person who would come into contact with the clemency petition that I had filed. And it was as we prayed that we started to see support for my case grow tremendously, beyond anything that we could have ever imagined. People all across the country, all over the world, started praying for my case. And even though a judge and jury once told me that I would be 67 years old before I ever got to meet with the parole board, I ended up meeting with them when I was just 30 years old. I was given the news finally on January 7th, 2019, that Governor Bill Haslam, despite all the odds, had decided to release me from prison. The first thing I did after hearing that news was marry the man who helped me to build the faith that freed me. For 2 years, this man had devoted his entire life spending nights awake praying over my situation and standing by me in my darkest moments. And there was no way I was going to spend another day of my life not being his wife. And although I get to live my happily ever after, my heart has never forgotten the lost little girl that I once was. Out in the world looking for the things that we all seek in life. But instead of finding fulfillment, I ended up in a tangle of insecurity, uncertainty, and misdirection. So today I share my testimony because I know that not much has changed in the last 15 years. All across the country are other lost little girls wandering down the same path that I had all those years before. And I wholeheartedly believe that each of us here today can play a role in making sure that they get their happy ending too.
Thank you for sharing, Cyntoia. I'm in tears, and it takes a lot to move me, but just thank God for just you and your faith, and just Him, just guiding your life. So just thank you. We are going to transition. We're going to bring on a few other people to help us to moderate a conversation with Cyntoia. We will also invite you all to add questions to the chat box or to the Q&A. We have joining us just Shira Hellier, who is our research coordinator, as well as so many different things. Fabulous. Our research coordinator here at GwenGirl at the Gwendolyn J. Elliott Institute. We have Dr. Georgia a few minutes earlier on the panel, and her work that she does around adultification and adultification bias. And then last and surely not least, we have Tawanda Clark Edgall, who is our Chief Program Officer here at GwenGirl, but again, she's so many different things as well. So thank you, ladies, for joining us for this conversation with Cyntoia. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you all to get started.
Okay, well, I'm going to start off our conversation. Cyntoia, just powerful. Thank you so much. I'm fangirling right now. It's just amazing. But so for much of the conference, we've been. Can y'all hear me? I'm sorry, there's a little bit of feedback. So much of the conversation, ironically or not so ironically, has really been talking about this idea of adultification bias, a construct that I developed where we really talk about how Black girls are seen as older, not needing to be comforted, not being seen as a victim. And we see this adultification bias emerging as early as age 5 among Black girls. So one of the questions that I want to pose is, do you think that there is a correlation between adultification bias and the commercial sexual exploitation of children?
Absolutely. All throughout the time when, I was staying with this group of women, there were also other girls that were around my age. There was one that was 1 year old, younger than me, another one that was like 2 years younger than me. And, they were referred to as kids. But because I was someone that, had been sexually active, I was grown. And, they treated me as I was part of the adult group. Instead of saying, you're a child, this is not okay that these adults are doing this with you, it was encouraged because I was, oh, well, she's grown. It was like, so absolutely, most definitely.
Yeah, and to follow up, I don't know if you got a chance to hear the panel. I'm calling it the GwenGirl podcast 2.0, but where these young women spoke about kind of the normalization of adultification in our communities, particularly in the Black communities. So have you, beyond kind of your experience with trafficking, have you seen this more or heard stories or can speak about what this kind of looks like? Because the word when I grew up was fast.
Fast. Mm-hmm. Hot.
Yeah, she's hot pants, fast. She grown. And that was used to really kind of as someone said in an earlier panel, make you complicit in what was happening. So can you just elaborate a little bit more about your experiences? I think we would all just want to hear your experiences.
Most definitely. And I did actually watch the podcast, really enjoyed it. I think it's really important for, survivors to actually have that platform and to have that space where they're actually teaching you what it is instead of, people just putting things out there, what they think it looks like. So like, I really enjoyed that. But for me, it's the same thing. I grew up, especially growing up in the South, where certain girls were considered fast and hot. Actually, in the state of Tennessee, it was just 1994 that there was a law on the books that if there was an adult man who was charged with statutory rape, he could present an affirmative defense if he could prove that that girl had had sex before. She was promiscuous. So that made it okay. So most definitely that's something that's still prevalent now. You would see young girls with older people, and it's not like other adults would feel the need to step in and say, here's a problem, there's something that needs to be addressed. You kind of just look the other way and say, oh, there she is going being fast. And I mean, no, like that's a red flag. That's when you step in and you say, hold on a minute, because this isn't right. But for some reason, we've been trained to think that that's okay. And that's just something that happens. And it's absolutely not.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna let Tashara jump in.
And there are people in the chat that are saying that it's been normalized. Mm-hmm. And you're 100% correct.
Someone actually said adultification was born in slavery. And I know that's a lot of Dr. Blake's research, and I can't agree enough. Cyntoia, you had me in tears during your talk, which is dangerous, girl, because my face is not beat like yours. And so it was about to be a real ugly when I got on it. But won't he do it? Thank you for putting everything that you said into a spiritual context as well. I think that's so important when we talk about just who you are as an inspiration. Piggybacking on Dr. Blake's point about language and this idea of being fast and being hot, you said so eloquently, at that time, you referring to your arrest, at that time, sex trafficking didn't apply to girls like me. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you could just put into context for us what it means for the importance of language and narratives to your case and other girls who have been in the life.
For me, it took more than 10 years for me to even understand that, not only wasn't my fault that adults had exploited me because I was a child. I didn't have the capacity to consent. And you certainly can't consent to your own exploitation. So it took me almost, the entire time that I was incarcerated to realize that. But then to even take it a step further and know that what happened with me was trafficking, that took an even longer journey. That took, an entire organization putting forth this public service announcement. In Slavery, Tennessee, they had this What is 13 campaign where they talked about how there's no such thing as a teenage prostitute. All my life, that is what I had been told that I was. And it wasn't just by people in my community. It was people in law enforcement. It was the district attorney. Just in 2019, the lead detective in my case showed up to my clemency hearing and specifically said, I don't know where all this talk of sex trafficking is coming from, because she knew what she was doing. So we're still having, the people, especially in these positions, that are using that language of prostitution. They're trying to say that, this is an act of volition instead of a violation against these young girls. And that's really powerful, not just when it comes to holding individuals accountable, but for girls to be able to identify as someone that's been victimized. I can't tell you what it feels like to spend so many years trapped in this prison of shame where you feel, dirty because of the things that you've done. You've been told that, these are things that you've done that made you, fast, that made you disgusting. And it's really harmful to your sense of self. And you're taking ownership on things that are not attributable to you.
I think your story is absolutely remarkable. I like that you spoke to resiliency through your faith. I think that is just a way to really build our young people up. As we have a lot of educators that are in the conference today, a lot of practitioners and social service people that are in the field today, can you speak and clarify so that people really understand the why behind the behavior and help people to understand those push-pull techniques? And you capitalized on that in your story. One of the things that I really liked about what you said is that you weren't like everyone else. You realized that in school. And although it seemed like you weren't like everyone else in a negative way, we see you now and we know you weren't like everyone else because you had a story that you were going to be sharing. But can you really speak to the push-pull techniques that our young people experience in reference to what pushes them into the life? And then once we get them out of the life, what might pull them back into it again?
So what led me, on this path of constantly seeking someplace where I felt that, that I belonged, where I felt that I was wanted, it goes all the way back from me finding out that, I was adopted and never really having anyone to help me cope with that, to help me understand that in a way that didn't leave me feeling like, I'm just an outcast. I don't belong here. I don't fit in here. It was never really addressed. And I want to be very careful in saying, that's not the fault of my parents. They tried, but it's not just the home that you're dealing with. When I go to school, that's a completely different environment. I'm being made to feel like that with my peers, and there's no one, no authority figure in that setting who's really going that extra mile to help me understand how to cope with that. We spend a lot of time teaching about math and social studies and science, but, what are you actually doing to help the child develop emotionally? There's more needs than just learning how to count when you're growing up. And a lot of time is spent at the school. And that's a big gap, that we see when it comes to kids going through the school system. So I kept getting into these situations because I was running away, looking for all of these different, circles where I felt that I belonged. And I found a home with other people who've been outcast. So I went from the classroom to in-school suspension, to being expelled and sent to alternative school, to life in facilities, to living on the run, and then, of course, into prison. So it's constantly just going down this slippery slope, and nobody really just seemed to take the time or to have the interest and really step in and figure out what's going on with this girl and what can I do to help her.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So your story seems to be a little different. Can you speak to once you were actually out of the life and you made the decision? Well, I guess being incarcerated helped you to make the decision too. You had some time while you were incarcerated to really think about the process. But can you speak to just your efforts and how you've been able to move forward and forge in such a way that supports young people? We are really happy to have you here, and you've really done a great job in inspiring us all. I think one of the things that gets missed in the social service field is that piece with resiliency. I think sometimes we don't see enough of those success stories. And so it's great to have you here today to really speak to that. I know we use something called the CANs here, and one of the things that Dr. Lyons talks about is young people that are connected to their faith in one way or another have better outcomes. And I don't want to monopolize the time because I could ask so many questions. I see the chat is exploding, so let's go to that.
All right, so I'll jump in with some of the questions from the chat because I actually had this same exact question, Cyntoia.
Okay.
Someone said, in school, what could have staff, teachers, and your mother, they included, have done differently? I really feel like your story is such an impactful case of what we call the school to prison pipeline, knowing where you started in a gifted program and the ways in which you were hyper penalized and policed. So what could have been done differently, especially in a school system for you?
So that's a good question. My mom, they would always call her when it was time to send me home, when they didn't want me there. They wanted to get rid of me, remove me from the learning environment. And when she would come to the school, like, she seemed to be at her wit's end. She didn't know what to do. She would actually ask them, well, what can I do? Is there, like, what's going on? Like, she didn't know. And why wasn't it that, there were behavioral health specialists that were there at the school who could have helped her, who could have told her some things that she could be doing? She had never had an experience dealing with a child that had different needs. My mother was well into her 30s whenever she adopted me. She had already raised 2 children. She needed someone to really help her kind of figure out what was going on, because she had never experienced anything like that. And I feel like the school really, really failed in that part. Anybody who's put in a position, you know, where they're in charge of taking care of children, I don't care if it's from the daycare to the school officials, I don't care if it's the gym coach, they should all have some type of training with behavioral health and learn how to address those issues as they come about. Unfortunately, when I was going through school, that was not the case.
So there's one question from the chat that says, are you currently in the process or working or involved in developing programs at school from an educational standpoint? Or you work in the schools to develop programs to help educators better serve youth that have behavioral needs?
So I do spend time, you know, speaking with groups of educators, but through my nonprofit, one of the things that I think is really important that we need to start speaking about in school is trafficking. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about what it's like. We don't talk about the different, you know, modes of entry into it. Like, it just seems like this strange phenomenon, and you end up with all these representations on television that are not anywhere near like what really happens. We need to start preparing kids to protect themselves and know what to look out for, and really address the needs that end up leading up to this path. Like with me, wanting to feel accepted, to feel belong, to feel wanted. That's what led me to look for all of these things. And, you know, that's a big issue. It's present in every single child there is. It doesn't matter where you come from. I was a straight A student that was constantly involved in extracurriculars, involved in the gifted program. If you would have asked my mother if she thought that would have happened with me, she would have told you absolutely not. But it does, and it can, and that's something that we need to be talking about.
So Cyntoia, I wanna piggyback to that, because that is really powerful, and that is a theme that is coming up a lot, is these needs and this kind of emotional interpersonal need and need to belong and acceptance. And I find that across all women and girls, we experience this, right? So I think we've all kind of, and also need to be beautiful and kind of acknowledge, but particularly among Black women and Black girls. And so just want to get your thoughts on how do we prevent this? What can we do to kind of fulfill this void? Because from my perspective, I feel like this is a societal kind of systemic thing that you know, it's in our socialization, but particularly Black women and girls not being valued and seen as beautiful. And this void seems to kind of just grow and grow. And it seems like it's one of the pulls that allows perpetrators to bring you into that life. So can you just reflect on that a little bit, just your thoughts?
I'll tell you, it's going to take an enormous shift in our current social norms. Anytime you have young girls growing up, and anywhere they look on their phones, the internet, television, and music, there's this constant devaluing of women. There's the commodification of women's bodies. They're going to get that message. It's going to sink in. Like when I was growing up, those are the things that impacted me. Making girls feel that they have to reveal themselves in a certain way, to present themselves in a certain way, to be attractive to people, and that's the goal in life. That's what they should be after. All these messages, you know, that's what we need to address. But, you know, people aren't really ready for that conversation. Adults aren't really ready to take responsibility for how the things that they're putting out and the way that they're portraying things is affecting young people.
I know that our young panelists talked earlier today that they felt that there was a difference in the way that they were treated, even in trafficking, based on color. Can you speak to any differences that you may have observed based on race with being in the life?
I can't, to be honest with you. I really can't, but I mean, it does not surprise me. I can tell you that. You see that in every area of life. It matters. You know, there's certain individuals that people consider exotic, and that seem to be held to a higher standard. All throughout life and throughout these different systems and things, we see people put into these different classes, and society gets to determine what's more desirable, what people should aspire to. And it's just, I mean, it's disgusting if you ask me.
what would you say to young girls who are struggling? And I talked briefly with you earlier, and I told you that I had a number of girls who knew that you were going to be here today and wanted tickets to get in. What would you say to young girls that are struggling, that are in the life, that want to get out but don't really know how?
I want them to know that there is a way. I can't tell you how many situations that I've been in where you can't really see your options. You don't know that you have options. You can't see the choices that you have. A lot of times you can't even see like the other side, to even know that there is an other side of the situation that you're in. But I can assure you, as sure as I'm sitting here today, as sure as you see me here today, what God did with me, he can do with you too. And when you give him that chance, I promise you he will. Sometimes you just have to step out on faith. That's exactly what I did. That's what I had to do. And if you do the same thing, he's going to bring you out of it. He'll put people in your lives who can show you. Sometimes it comes in the most unexpected times, the most unexpected places. The Holy Spirit can call to mind things that you don't even know where it came from. You don't even know where this plan, this direction came from. But when you can allow yourself to tap into that, I promise you, he'll make a way for you.
Amen. Along that same vein of the question that Tawanda just asked Cyntoia, someone said, what would you tell your 14-year-old self?
That's right.
Whew. Girl, go home.
Right.
But, it's for me to tell my 14-year-old self, just like, you don't have to chase after acceptance from all these different people. There's always going to be somebody who's going to hold a different standard that they feel that you have to meet to be acceptable, to be presentable, to be welcomed. Stop basing your life, stop basing your happiness and your sense of wellness on other people's standards. You are already accepted. You are accepted by the person who is in charge of this entire universe. Like, you are an heir to the greatest kingdom in the entire universe. You don't have to prove anything to anybody. I promise you. Go home, go back home, go to school, do what you got to do, get through it. There's going to be a better day. God has a plan for you.
So I have one more question, Cyntoia, that was in the chat. And I appreciate, the spiritual lens that you are presenting this. But what was posed is, if you are a clinician that doesn't have that kind of spirituality, what strategies can you use to kind of support or help girls in the life? It's a tough one, I know.
For me, it all comes down to knowing your true identity. And to be honest with you, I would be lying to you if I told you that, if you don't have yourself grounded, your sense of identity grounded in that, in his unchanging hand, you really can't guide anyone to where they need to be honest with you. And, that's not to offend anybody. I just have to tell you from my experience, I've tried everything else and it failed every single time. And I ended up lost at the end of it all. When I tried to throw myself into try and achieve different accomplishments in the classroom, and I prided myself on how intelligent I was, and that grit and pushing through, it's going to fail you. I promise you. It'll feel good for a great moment, and the next thing you know, you are rock bottom, and you still feel like you feel alone, you feel vulnerable, you feel dissatisfied. It all comes down to that, and it's only him who's going to pull you from that. So if you're someone who's really looking to do this work, I encourage you to find who you are in Christ, to find that faith and build on that before you can actually go out and pull someone else out from their deepest parts.
I really appreciate you sharing your perspective, and I just think that's wonderful. Yeah.
Kathy, you're muted.
Okay. I was saying we have a few more minutes. If you all want to just take one or two more questions from the chat, we can do that. And then we'll end at 1.
So what we're hearing from the chat, I think it's important that you know that people are like, amen. They appreciate the fact that you have really spoke to faith and how that has been something that has helped you to transition into the life that you're in right now. And if I'm just going to encourage people, if you have any questions, any real questions, like our younger people said earlier today, please put them in the chat. This is an opportunity to get clarity, to ask questions, and to really get the support. I think the other thing that you said, I think that sometimes when people get wrapped up in this work, they have this savior complex. And what you talked about was something very different. You talked about actually doing the work through your faith, yourself, and having someone that actually supported you in this process, but you made that transition yourself. And I think that when you're practitioners and you're therapists in this field, we have to remember that the work is, up to the individual. We plant the seeds, we support them, and we encourage them. You want to speak a little bit to that? And then I see there's another question too about what opportunities. I'm jumping around. So if you want to answer that, then we'll just go to this next chat question.
Absolutely. I always tell people, when I'm speaking to women, speaking to girls, who are dealing with trauma, who are dealing with, the after effects of everything, you take your time. Like, you're not on anybody else's timetable. You're not on anybody else's schedule for your healing. It's different for everyone, and be gentle with yourself. Don't let someone make you think that you have to do certain things within a certain amount of time. Like, that's just not based in reality, and it's not healthy for yourself. For people who are looking to help individuals, you have got to be willing to be patient. You can't force something down someone's throat. All you can do is be there. I can tell you, even with me, I wasn't always receptive to people who were offering me help, but those seeds that were planted, it could be years down the road that those seeds that were planted actually started developing. And, that really helped me in the end. But I can't tell you one positive story that really helped me to develop and move past all of my trauma from someone who was constantly trying to force something down my throat, who was getting frustrated with me because I wasn't doing things the way that they felt that they should be done or on their timetable.
Thank you for that. That was very helpful.
Well, thank you, ladies. Awesome job, Cyntoia. Thank you. Hopefully you'll come back and spend more time with us.